Hello, I'm Zach Finn, and I'm here to give you a behind the scenes look in risk management in the food industry. Let me make sure my slides are up here. There we go, perfect. So I'm going to give you a behind the scenes look at risk management in the food industry. I studied insurance and risk management myself, and my dream was to be the risk manager of a large Fortune 500 company. I was very fortunate to get to have that job and do it for the J.M. Smucker Company. And I did it for the J.M. Smucker Company at a very unique time. I started right after they had finished being a $600 million jam and jelly company that simply bought insurance to a company that did a number of acquisitions. In fact, we did 11 of them while I was there, and it became a multi-branded international Fortune 500 company. And so not only did I get to work in a risk management department, but I got to design a risk management department. And I had such a great experience doing that I actually taught that at Butler University. And now I'm at Hub International. We're the sixth largest insurance broker in the world. And my job is basically to help companies design their risk management programs. So today I'm going to give you a behind the scenes look at how you would do that if you found yourself in the food industry. And I want to focus on the food industry because I think one of the biggest parts about being a risk management that folks need to concentrate on is what is the industry in which you work. I work for a casket and hospital bed manufacturer and an ATM and a cash register manufacturer. And I can tell you that the risk management issues for a casket company are completely different than the risk management issues for a food company. For example, you don't get many product liability claims from a casket company because your customers are dead and they can't really complain. But you have other issues. It's a heavier type of manufacturing, and so you might have more workers' comp or employee injuries to deal with. So again, I think the biggest part about starting any risk management role, whether you're the risk manager or you're supporting a risk management function, is understanding the industry in which that organization operates and what the universe of risks actually looks like. So what you see here is what I would consider to be the universe of risks for the food industry. The ones in green are risks that are generally considered to be insurable. Although if you look at things like product contamination or workplace violence, there can be insurance for some of those types of risk. But again, whether there's insurance for that risk or not, doesn't mean you necessarily want to buy it. And if there are risks for which there are no insurance, it doesn't mean you don't need to manage them. And so as you start your job as a risk manager, one of the questions you'll get from inside your company and outside your company is, what's our number one risk? And my answer when I was asked this by Richard Smucker was, I don't know. And the reason I said that is because we didn't spend any time talking about the business and what his most important thing was from his perspective. And so when you look at any organization, and when I worked at Smucker, for example, we had 3 jam and jelly plants and 1 peanut butter plant. We later acquired a coffee plant. We had a baking plants. And so when you consider what each of those operations does, the profit margins on coffee are completely different than the profit margins on jams and jellies. Whereas jams and jellies have the legacy and heritage of the Smucker brand that you need to protect. All of the brands have food safety risks that need to be considered. Each of them have a different strategic value to the business. And so these are all things that you want to understand. The most important risk for any company is their most important thing. And so this is what I really like about risk management is getting that time to go out in the organization, not being tied to a desk, and really managing by walking around. What is our competitive environment? What are our competitors doing? If we sell peanut butter, who else is selling peanut butter? What does the risk landscape look like over the next 5 years? And if you think about the last 5 years and everything that we've gone through with COVID and inflation and tariffs, a lot can happen in 5 years, which is why risk management is really a never-ending process. And so you think about what's happened over the last several years at your organization, you think about what's happening over the next several years and what the goals of the organization are, you start to begin to understand what are our most critical operations and infrastructure. What do we need to actually fulfill our strategic plans, to meet our mission and values, to support our employees, to have safe products, to provide value to our consumers, to navigate our competitive environment? And it's really only once you understand those questions that you can begin to think about how to manage the risks. And for me, I think one of the most enjoyable things is to figure out how a company makes their products. And so in the food industry, we would talk about this from farm to fork. So if we're making chocolate, for example, where are we sourcing those cocoa beans? And by the way, are we going to be able to continue to do that with climate change and some of the temperature changes and growing patterns around the country, different countries of the world? And where do we get our raw materials? What's our most critical raw material? Certain things you can buy sugar from all different kinds of places. There are certain specialty oils that you use in making peanut butter that only come from one place. And so part of my job was to begin to understand so that when I have a conversation with someone like Richard Smucker, I can have a really intelligent conversation about what his number one thing is. I told him, I imagine a lot of people talk to you about your jelly plants because your name's Smucker and that's the name on the door. But he had 3 of those at the time I was talking to him, and they were older at the time and maybe not as efficient as they could be. And there was excess capacity in each of those plants. And so it was one of those things where if we lost one of those plants to a fire and nobody was hurt, he might not have been that upset because we would have had an insurance recovery. We could have built a new, more efficient plant and picked up the slack with the other plants that still remain. And so, my comment to him was, I bet a lot of people talk to you about jam and jelly because that's what your company did for over 100 years. But that's 7% of the revenue that you're making right now that we're having this conversation. At the same time we're having this conversation, it's the Great Recession. Peanut butter is the cheapest protein in the store. There's a recall going on with one of our competitors where we can get their market share. So literally every molecule of peanut butter we can make, we can sell, and we only have one plant. And one of the analysis that we try to understand is, well, what's the business interruption of that plant? And so the answer is every minute, or every hour that plant was down at the time I had that conversation would be $55,000, $60,000 an hour. And so that's what risk management is all about is what's your number one risk? How bad can it be? And what's likely to go wrong, and develop a plan for what we can do about it. And why you want to spend so much time looking at the industry and the company and the different plants and the operations is because, if you've ever taken a punch, and most of you probably didn't have as wild a teenage years as I did, but I took a few punches in my day, and it really depends on where you get hit as to how much damage is done. And that's what we're really trying to have as a conversation with our C-suite is, what's our number one plan? If we have product contamination, and by the way, in the food industry, that generally is the number one risk and the one that we're going to talk about here today. But product contamination doesn't mean the same thing in a coffee plant where it's highly acidic and it's roasted at a high temperature. It doesn't mean the same thing in a jelly plant where products are pasteurized. It means something completely different in a peanut butter plant where salmonella can be an issue, or maybe in a ready-to-eat meat production facility where listeria can be an issue. So again, having that knowledge of the organization allows you to understand what are the number one risks, what are the punches, but what's the damage likely to be when those punches hit. And so, if I work for a client that has outsourced their logistics operations, we don't really have to spend a lot of time talking about auto risks. We spend a lot of time talking about perhaps business interruption or product contamination. And again, we focus on those areas of the company where we're going to lose the most revenue, we're going to lose the most market share, where we have the highest likelihood of having an incident, where we're going to get the most bang for our risk management buck. And so as we consider the universe of risks and how bad they can be, and that's a lot of risks. That's one of the things that can be overwhelming when you find yourself as risk manager of a large organization is there's like a never-ending list of risks. And every time you turn on the news, there's even more risks that it seems like you have to deal with. So one of the tools we use is a risk map. We try to figure out what's the frequency and what's the severity of a risk. So again, if you're a company that has autos, you're probably going to have auto accidents at some high frequency and varying degree of severity, probably quite a few fender benders, maybe a couple of serious auto accidents. And again, that's one of the things you want to look at. If you're a company that's having a lot of auto accidents, and particularly serious auto accidents, it's high frequency, it's high severity, we need to spend some risk management time dealing with that. That's just table stakes. At the same time, you could be thinking about something like a pandemic. We looked at pandemic risk when I was a risk manager in 2010, and we really didn't do anything with it. We recognized that it was a risk. It was something that was very serious. We looked at pandemic insurance. It was very expensive, and we really didn't think it made sense for the company at the time. In fact, I don't know that it would have still made sense. But when we had that conversation, I can tell you we never imagined what COVID would be like and what the extent of the shutdowns would actually be. And we could have made all the risk management plans in the world, and it still would not have addressed or even come close to what actually happened. And so a lot of those high severity, low frequency risks are really judgment calls. You make the best decision you can, and you really can't, again, mitigate every single bad thing that can happen. And so what you want to focus on are the high severity, high frequency things, the business killers, the low hanging fruit, and the ones that are, again, low severity, low frequency, but quality control. We want to make sure that we run a solid operation. Just because paper cuts are not minor or not major issues doesn't mean we don't want to address them. If we see them in our loss runs, or we see folks getting foreign material in their eye, those could be minor injuries, minor issues. But again, we want to prevent the things that we can measure and understand. So for the food industry, it really is product contamination. That is the number one risk. That's what Richard Smucker expected me to say. That's what most C-level executives of a food company would expect you to say. What is my number one risk? It is product contamination. Again, you want to be able to narrow that down to what specific products that applies to, and what specific operations have the greatest exposure. But it is a nasty one, and it's a lot worse than it used to be. Number one, with social media, if you have an issue with your product, it doesn't take very long for the rest of the world to know that. Because of the genome being mapped and better epidemiological evidence, we can tie a recall back to a specific manufacturer or supplier, a manufacturing line. And so it's just a lot more serious. It's a lot easier to identify that a recall was your fault, to where you have the financial responsibility to make that right. Whereas in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, a lot of folks got diarrhea, and maybe Taco Bell got the blame. And you know what? They didn't do anything, it turns out. So as we think about product contamination and we think about the risk management process, again, we want to understand, now that we've identified that risk, how bad is it likely to be? If I go back to that peanut butter plant example, every hour that plant is down is $55,000 an hour. So if we can manage that recall in 4 days, that's great. But if we can manage it in 4 hours, that's even better. And that's part of the job of a risk manager, is helping folks to understand the stakes that are involved and to understand why it's imperative to have crisis response plans, to do recall simulations, to make sure that we can execute on a recall in 4 hours instead of 4 days. And by the way, not just because it saves money, but because it saves lives. Our number one goal is to put out safe products for our consumers. And as you think about the risk management process, we're not going to avoid making delicious products. That's just not a risk management solution that's available. So we need to think about some of the other risk management solutions that are available in the food industry. Again, if you worked in construction or a coal mine or a university, there would be a number of different loss prevention and control measures that you might focus on. For the food industry, and particularly for product contamination, we're focusing on food safety. And to me, one of the best loss prevention and control standards is HACCP. It's hazard analysis, critical control point. I won't spend a lot of time on what that is right now, but what I can tell you is it's so valuable that I got a HACCP certification, not so that I could go out and do food safety work in the plants, but so I could understand what the food safety folks were saying when they were talking to me. And what HACCP is basically all about is identifying any way that your product could be infected with anything that's not supposed to be there, whether it's biological like listeria, or chemical or cleaning material on your equipment that gets into the food, or radiological or physical, or an undeclared allergen. Whatever that might be, we can't allow that to happen. Folks will only see your name in the news with an unsafe product so many times before they stop buying. And that's why that becomes a business killing loss. So from a food safety perspective, we're looking at sanitation, we're looking at verifying our suppliers and auditing them, allergen controls, good manufacturing practices, and really trying to prevent as many losses as we possibly can. The next thing we want to do is recognize that we can't prevent everything, and we want to have an insurance program. And so as a risk manager, you get to work with all the underwriters for the different lines of insurance you might buy. And this is an example of a Fortune 500 insurance program. Each of the little blocks there represents an insurance coverage, and each of the colors represents a different insurance carrier. And by the way, when you're buying insurance for a multi-billion-dollar company, you're not buying it from one insurance company. You may be buying it from dozens of insurance companies across the world. You may be going to Lloyd's of London or Bermuda or Switzerland. So managing an insurance renewal for a large corporation is not like buying insurance for your Honda Accord. These are usually 9-12 month projects in some cases. You start next year's renewal right after the last one finished. And the number one goal is to make sure you understand, what is my company's risk tolerance? How bad are my losses likely to be? What's our risk bearing capacity? And how much insurance do we need? No one has enough money to cover every single bad thing that could happen. But at the same time, you can't buy enough insurance for every possible thing that could happen, nor would you want to. And so that's really the risk manager's job, is to figure out do we buy insurance or not buy insurance? And so this is based on, if you're studying insurance, the tenets of insurability, what makes something insurable or not insurable. And again, we won't spend a lot of time on this. We'll have the slides available for you. But if you think about a risk like fire versus a risk like COVID, you're not necessarily required to buy pandemic insurance. And so the only people who buy pandemic insurance are people with a pandemic risk, like Carnival Cruise Lines. If you have a pandemic loss, it's going to happen to everybody all at the same time. And so that's not a really great risk to insure, because again, not everybody's forced into the risk pool. The losses, when they happen, are catastrophic. And the only people who buy coverage are people who are likely to have losses. If you take that and transition it with fire and property risk, well, if you have a mortgage or a note on your building, you're required to buy property insurance, whether you're a good risk or a bad risk. The risk is generally fairly predictable as far as the severity and the frequency. And by the way, if my house is on fire right now while I give this presentation, I can guarantee you that you who are listening to it, your house is not on fire as a result of mine. Whereas if we were under a pandemic, we could all be under a lockdown together. And so that's what makes something like a pandemic risk really hard to insure and something you wouldn't buy insurance for. Whereas as property insurance, not only would you want to buy insurance for it, you may actually be required to buy insurance for it. And so that's the job of a risk manager, is to help the company understand that. Workers' comp is required by law, auto insurance is required by law. Other insurance coverages like cyber and D&O insurance are judgment calls. How much do you want to buy, and how does the company feel about that? Once you have an insurance program in place, and that's really where the normal risk management process ends off, is you identify and measure the risk, you examine the feasibility of risk management alternatives, so the loss prevention we talked about, food safety, you put your insurance program in force and you manage it and you monitor it. But I always add the additional risk management step of claims management and crisis preparedness and response planning. Because the bottom line is no matter how good you are, how much you prepare for something, there are losses that are going to happen. And so in the food industry, we address that through product recall preparedness plans. We typically, and usually this will be managed by the risk manager or out of the risk management department, but as a recall coordinator or crisis response coordinator. And basically the job of the risk manager when a crisis like this happens is to marshal the entire organization. I mean, if you think about it, if you have a product in the store that's unsafe, you have to understand, how much did we make? Where else did we send that? Did we clean the equipment after we made it, or did we make more stuff that's also contaminated? Are the trucks contaminated? Do all the customers know about this? Has someone gotten sick? Is it in the media? Have we told the FDA? Those are a lot of questions that come up when you have a recall. And the bottom line is, you as the risk manager, your job is to be smart enough to know when to get somebody smarter than you. And really your job is to identify who those smart people are ahead of time and have a team ready to go with legal, supply chain, your plants, your quality control folks, so that you can quarterback the crisis and do things like identify every single contaminated product and where it went within 4 hours, and have it off every store shelf if it's in the stream of commerce within 72 hours, be able to hold it and test it to confirm whether it's your fault or not, to destroy it appropriately, to make sure it doesn't end up back on the market through being pirated by some kind of means. And again, those are all strict standards that need to be met. Because one of the things you understand as a risk manager is time is not your friend. When something first is identified, it's an unusual occurrence, and the longer you let it go, the longer you're going to have a huge crisis on your hands. So I'll stop there. That's what risk management looks like in the food industry. It's a big job and a lot to cover in 20 minutes, but I hope that's been valuable for you. I would say the big takeaways that I would leave for you is understand your industry. The food industry is different than if you're a risk manager in baking or risk management for a university. And then once you understand your industry, understand your company. Just like your neighbors may have fancy cars and a lot of debt, and you may be completely debt-free, your deductibles and retentions on your insurance may be different than theirs. And so you want to understand your company, their goals, and how they differ from their competitors. And from there, do the best you can. It's all about gaining yards every day and improving the risk of your company, with the understanding that it's really a never-ending job, but one that can be very meaningful. Because at the end of the day, what we get to do is prevent bad things from happening to good people. And we get to put things back together when it goes bad. And that's a very fulfilling job. And so I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.